My name is Margaret Doyle Sinclair. Everyone calls me Maggie. I'm 34 years old, and the day my brother's lawyer slid a folder across a conference table and said, "We'll see you in court," I looked him in the eye, smiled, and said, "Good to know." 3 weeks later, I was the one handing a folder to a judge, and when His Honor opened it and read the first page out loud, the entire courtroom went so quiet I could hear the air conditioning click on. This is the story of how my own family tried to erase my name from everything my father built, and how a woman who never raises her voice took every single thing back, with paper. Not with rage. Welcome to her quiet reckoning, where composed women finally stop being underestimated. If you've ever been the responsible one who got punished for being responsible, stay with me, because this one's for you. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and subscribe, because you will not see this ending coming. Let me back up. Because none of what happened in that courtroom makes sense unless you understand what I was protecting, and why I was so slow to believe I needed to protect it at all. I grew up in Asheville, North Carolina, in a narrow blue house on Merriman Avenue that my father built his whole life around. My dad, Robert Sinclair, started a small precision machining company out of a rented garage bay when he was 26 years old. By the time I was in high school, Sinclair Precision Components had 11 employees, a real building off Riverside Drive, and a reputation for being the shop you called when the big manufacturers needed something done right the first time. My father was not a warm man in the way people mean when they say warm. He didn't hug easily, but he showed up. He drove me to every accounting competition in high school. Yes, I was that kid. And he sat in the back of gymnasiums in his work boots, arms crossed, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. And then he'd tell people at church the next week that his daughter had placed second in the state. I have a younger brother, Trevor. Trevor is 31 now. Trevor was the kind of kid teachers described as a lot of potential for 15 years running, which is a polite way of saying he never once had to try, and somewhere along the way that turned into never trying at all. He was funny. He was easy to love in a room. He was also, by the time he was 25, on his third failed business, all of them funded in part by loans my father co-signed and my mother quietly enabled. I studied accounting at UNC Asheville, passed my CPA exam on the first try, and went to work for a regional accounting firm before eventually taking over the books for my father's company, informally at first, then officially, once he trusted me with the whole picture. By the time I was 28, I wasn't just the daughter who was good with numbers. I was the person who understood, better than anyone alive, including my father, exactly how Sinclair Precision Components actually worked. Every vendor contract, every equipment loan, every tax filing, every dollar. My mother, Linda, was a different kind of presence entirely. She managed the house, managed appearances, and managed, this is the word I'd use now, looking back, narratives. She had a gift for deciding what a situation meant before anyone else in the room had finished processing it, and then repeating that version so calmly and so often that it simply became the truth everyone operated on. I want to be fair here, because a woman telling this story owes you fairness even about the people who hurt her. My mother was not cruel to me growing up. She was, if anything, proud of me in the specific way parents are proud of a child who solves problems without being asked. What I didn't understand until much later is that pride and usefulness can look identical from the inside, and only one of them is actually love. My father died 4 years ago. Congestive heart failure, 61 years old, 6 weeks between diagnosis and the end. I moved back to Asheville the month he got sick and never really left again. I sat with him most nights in that hospital room while my mother went home to sleep, and Trevor came and went on his own unpredictable schedule, sometimes staying 20 minutes, sometimes not showing up at all. 2 nights before he died, my father was lucid for about an hour, which the nurses told us was common right before the end, a strange, clear window. He held my hand and he said, "The business keeps your mother steady, Maggie. Don't let anybody break it apart for parts." Those were close to his exact words. I've turned them over in my head more times than I could count. I promised him I wouldn't let that happen. I meant it the way you mean things you say to a dying parent. Completely. Permanently. Without knowing yet what it would cost you. What I didn't know, sitting in that hospital room holding my father's hand, was that the person who would eventually try to break the business apart for parts wasn't some outside threat. It was going to be my own brother, with my own mother's quiet blessing, using my own name to do it. Grief does strange things to a family's math. In the first year after my father died, I stepped into running the day-to-day operations of Sinclair Precision Components, almost without anyone deciding it out loud. I wasn't the owner on paper. The company had passed, per my father's will, into a family trust, with my mother as trustee and Trevor and me as equal beneficiaries. But I was the one who kept it alive. I renegotiated a supplier contract that would have cost us our biggest client. I caught a bookkeeping error from the previous accountant that would have triggered an IRS audit. I worked 60-hour weeks for a salary that was, frankly, insulting given what I was actually doing, because nobody sat down and renegotiated it, and I didn't ask, because asking felt like making my grief about money. Trevor, meanwhile, drifted in and out of a vague operations title that mostly meant he showed up when he felt like it, took credit for decisions in front of clients that I had actually made, and periodically asked me for advances against future profit distributions that never quite got repaid. Here's the part that still sits strangely in my chest when I think about it. I never said no. Not once in almost 4 years. When Trevor needed $12,000 to cover a lease deposit on an apartment he couldn't otherwise afford, I authorized it out of the company account and told myself it was a loan. When my mother wanted to redo the kitchen in the house my father had left her, the house the trust technically owned, since Dad had transferred it in for tax reasons years earlier, I signed off on pulling $40,000 from company reserves without asking a single hard question. Because it was my mother, and my mother had just lost her husband, and I was the responsible one, and responsible people don't make their grieving mother beg. I told myself I was keeping the family steady, exactly like my father asked. What I didn't let myself see for a long time was that keeping the family steady had quietly turned into absorbing every cost so nobody else had to feel any friction at all. There's a specific moment I go back to now, a small one from about 2 years after Dad died. We were doing a walkthrough of the shop floor with a potential new client, a mid-size aerospace supplier out of Greenville that could have doubled our annual revenue if we landed the contract. I had spent 3 weeks preparing the pitch, the capacity numbers, the quality certifications, the pricing model. Trevor showed up 20 minutes late in a blazer that still had the tag half tucked into the sleeve, shook the client's hand, and delivered my pitch back to them almost word for word, gesturing at the machines like he'd personally calibrated every one of them. I stood 2 feet away and said nothing, because correcting him in front of a client felt petty, and because some old, tired part of me still believed that if I just kept doing the work well enough, eventually somebody would notice whose work it actually was. Nobody noticed. Or rather, someone noticed, but not in the way I expected. There were other small moments like that. The kind that don't feel like evidence of anything when you're living through them one at a time, and only add up to a pattern when you go back later and lay them all out on a table. There was the company Christmas party the year after Dad died, where Trevor stood up and gave a toast about carrying on Dad's legacy, and didn't mention my name once. Not even in passing, while I stood near the back by the folding tables refilling the coffee urn because somebody had to. There was the time a regional trade magazine did a small profile on the company and quoted Trevor extensively about our growth strategy, a strategy that existed entirely because I had spent 4 months building a new pricing model he had never once asked to see. There was the quiet way decisions started getting made in conversations I wasn't part of. A new equipment lease, a change in one of our insurance policies, that I'd only find out about afterward. Always framed as, oh, we figured you were busy with the books. We didn't want to bother you. I want to be honest about something here, because I think it matters for anyone listening to this who recognizes themselves in it. I didn't push back on any of it at the time. Not really, not with any force. I told myself a version of events where I was simply the quiet, competent one who didn't need the credit, who found the spotlight uncomfortable anyway, who would rather be respected for the work than praised for it in a toast. There's a kind of pride you can build out of being unbothered by being overlooked. I'd gotten very good at that particular kind of pride. It took me a long time to understand that it wasn't strength. It was just a socially acceptable way of not dealing with what was actually happening. The first sign that something was actually wrong, and not just the ordinary unfairness of being the responsible sibling, came about 8 months before the lawsuit. It was small enough that I almost let myself explain it away, which in hindsight is exactly what it was designed for. I ran a routine credit check on the business. something I do twice a year. The same way I've always pulled my own personal credit report on a schedule, because I trust documentation more than I trust people's memories of what they agreed to. I found a business line of credit application filed with a regional bank 3 months earlier, listing Sinclair Precision Components as the borrower and requesting $95,000 in operating capital. I hadn't filed it. As far as I knew, we didn't need it. Cash flow had actually been strong that quarter, one of our better ones since Dad died. I called the bank. After being passed between 2 departments, I reached a loan officer who confirmed the application had been submitted and signed by an authorized company officer, and that the funds had, in fact, already been dispersed 2 months prior into an account associated with the company's EIN. She could not tell me more without a written request, given privacy protocols, but she did say one thing that has stayed lodged in my head ever since. The signature on file matches your previous filings, ma'am. This looks like standard renewal paperwork to us. $95,000 had already left an account with our company's tax ID on it, and I hadn't authorized a single dollar of it. I want to be very clear about what I did next, because it matters later. I did not call my brother and accuse him of anything. I did not confront my mother. I am, by training and by nature, a person who verifies before she reacts. I filed a formal written request with the bank for the complete loan file. I opened a private folder on my own laptop. Not the shared company drive, my own personal, encrypted laptop. And I started documenting. Dates, names, every phone call. Logged the way I log everything, out of habit. The same habit that used to make my office manager tease me about running an audit on a family wedding. When I brought up the credit line at a family dinner 2 weeks later, carefully, gently framed as, I noticed something on the books I wanted to ask about. My mother didn't even look up from her plate. Oh, that was Trevor being proactive, she said. He wanted a cushion in case a big order came in. You worry so much, Maggie. Let your brother contribute something for once. Trevor didn't deny it. He didn't confirm it either. He just said, it's handled, in the tone of someone closing a cabinet door, and changed the subject to a fishing trip he was planning. It's handled. I would come to understand, much later, exactly how much work that phrase was doing. I let it go, not because I believed the explanation, but because I had learned, over 4 years of being the family's designated grown-up, that pushing too hard on anything got labeled as me making it about money, a phrase my mother deployed with surgical precision whenever I asked a question she didn't want to answer. And so the same cold, careful, professional part of my brain that had opened a private folder on my laptop simply kept it open and kept adding to it, quietly, for the next 8 months while on the surface. Everything appeared to go on exactly as before. Everything accelerated on a Tuesday evening in March, at what was supposed to be a routine annual trust meeting, the kind of thing our family's estate attorney, a careful silver-haired man named Arthur Kessler, who had drafted my father's original trust documents, insisted on holding every year, just to keep everyone honest, as he used to put it, with no idea how literally that phrase was about to apply. I arrived at Arthur's office on Patton Avenue at 5 o'clock, expecting the usual 45 minutes of reviewing distributions and signing routine paperwork. My mother and Trevor were already seated when I walked in, and something in the room's temperature told me immediately that this was not going to be routine. Arthur wasn't running the meeting. A different attorney was, a younger man I didn't recognize, introduced to me as representing the trust's interest going forward, which struck me as an odd phrase, since Arthur had represented the trust's interest for 4 years without anyone needing to clarify that. My mother spoke first. She had that particular stillness in her face that I had learned, over 34 years, to read as the calm before something deliberately cruel. Maggie, she said, we've made a decision as a family. Trevor is going to be taking over primary operational control of the company. We think it's time you stepped back into more of an advisory role. I asked what, exactly, advisory role meant, and what had prompted this. My mother's answer was the kind of sentence that sounds reasonable exactly once, and only if you don't ask a single follow-up question. You've been under a lot of stress since your father passed. We just think the business needs someone with a bit more vision. Trevor has ideas for where to take things. You've always been better with the numbers than the big picture. I looked at Trevor. Trevor looked at his phone. I said I'd need to see documentation supporting a change like this. Trust amendments require specific procedures, and I knew that because I had, of course, read every page of my father's trust documents years earlier, cover to cover, the way I read everything. The new attorney slid a folder across the table. Inside was a trust amendment, dated 6 weeks earlier, purportedly signed by all 3 beneficiaries. My mother, Trevor, and me, reallocating operational authority, and buried on page 4 in language dense enough to be easy to skim past. Adjusting the distribution formula so that going forward, Trevor would receive 60% of company profit distributions, and I would receive the remainder, a complete reversal of the equal split my father had specified. I had never seen that document before in my life. I had certainly never signed it. I want you to picture the version of me who sat in that chair. I did not raise my voice. I did not knock the folder off the table, though something in my chest wanted to. I asked very calmly for a copy of the amendment to review with my own counsel. The new attorney hesitated, glanced at my mother, and then said the sentence that ended any pretense of family being family in that room. Given the disagreement here, I think it's best if further communication happens through counsel. If this can't be resolved amicably, we'll see you in court. My mother did not correct him. My brother did not look up from his phone. I closed my folder, stood up and said, "Good to know." Then I drove home, hands steady at 10 and 2. The way I always drive when everything in me wants to fall apart, and I refuse to let it happen behind the wheel. That night, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold beside my laptop, I opened the private folder I had been keeping for 8 months and finally let myself see the whole shape of what was in it. The unauthorized credit line. The signature the bank had called matching our previous filings. Filings I now needed to actually compare against my real signature. Because a small, cold voice in the back of my head had started to suspect I already knew the answer. The vague, "It's handled" from my brother. And now, a trust amendment with my forged signature on it, reallocating 60% of my father's company to a man who showed up 20 minutes late to the pitch that was going to save it. I did 4 things in order, the way I do everything. First, I called Arthur Kessler directly, at home, and asked him point blank whether he had drafted or witnessed the amendment I'd been shown. There was a long pause on the line, and then he said quietly, "Maggie, I need you to come into my office tomorrow morning. I did not draft that document, and I want to see exactly what you were shown. Second, I requested certified copies of my own signature on file with the County Register of Deeds, the bank, and my CPA license records. Every legitimate document bearing my actual signature, spanning back a decade, so I would have an unimpeachable baseline for comparison. Third, I called a forensic document examiner. I had, in my years of accounting work, referred exactly one client to a forensic examiner for a fraud case, years earlier, and I still had her card. Her name was Renata Ford, and when I explained the situation over the phone, she said something I've never forgotten. People who forge signatures almost always get the letters right and the rhythm wrong. Bring me everything you have. Fourth, I retained an attorney of my own, not Arthur. Arthur, it turned out, had been quietly pushed out of handling the trust's day-to-day matters over the previous 2 months, replaced by the younger attorney my mother and Trevor had brought in. A fact that told me everything about how long this had actually been planned. I retained a litigation attorney named Diane Ashworth, a sharp, unhurried woman with a reputation around Asheville for being exactly the kind of lawyer you wanted, representing you and never wanted representing the person across the table from you. I laid everything out for Diane on her conference table 2 days later, in the same neat, chronological order I use for tax files. The credit line documentation, the trust amendment, my verified signature samples. She read for a long time without speaking, the way people do when they're trying not to let their face give away how bad or how good something looks. Finally, she looked up. "Maggie, I want you to understand what I'm looking at. This isn't a family disagreement. This is fraud, and depending on how the amendment was executed and notarized, it may be forgery as a matter of law, not just as a matter of your opinion." She let that settle. Then she laid out my options, the same cold, clear way Arthur's calm silence over the phone had already told me things were serious. I asked her what she would do. She said, "I'd want to know exactly how forged that signature is before I decided anything. Get me Renata's report and then we'll talk." Renata Ford's office was a converted studio above a print shop on Lexington Avenue, cluttered with light boxes and magnification equipment that looked more like something out of a crime lab than an accounting dispute. I brought her the trust amendment, my verified signature exemplars, and, at her request, several years of documents I had genuinely signed for the business, so she could study not just the shape of my signature, but its natural rhythm. Pressure points, the specific hesitation I have before the final letter of my last name, a habit apparently unique enough to be useful. It took her 9 days. When she called, she didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Ms. Sinclair, I'm confident in stating that the signature on the trust amendment is not consistent with your genuine signature. Whoever produced it was working from an older sample. I'd estimate 7 to 10 years old, based on stroke characteristics you no longer exhibit. It's a competent forgery, not a great one, 7 to 10 years old." My mind went immediately to a single place, the fireproof lockbox my father had kept in his home office closet, containing old family documents, my original CPA application, an old passport, a decade-old notarized power of attorney form I'd signed for him during a hospital stay when I was 24, back before my signature had settled into the version I use now. That lockbox had passed, along with everything else in the house, to my mother. Only one person had access to that box: the bank's loan file, which finally arrived from my written request around the same time, told the rest of the story. The credit line application had been submitted online, but the disbursement authorization required an in-person signature at a branch. According to the branch's own records, the in-person signing had taken place on a Thursday afternoon in July, a date I could account for entirely, because that was the week of the Carolinas Manufacturing Alliance Conference in Charlotte, where I had been registered, badge scanned into 3 separate sessions, and had a hotel folio and a dinner receipt from a restaurant 2 hours away from the branch in question, time-stamped almost to the minute of the supposed signing. I laid the badge scan report next to the bank's signing log the way you'd lay 2 mismatched puzzle pieces on a table, and for the first time since that meeting in Arthur's office, I felt something other than dread. I felt the ground shift under me, toward my side of the table. Diane and I sent a formal demand letter within the week. Certified mail, return receipt requested, addressed jointly to my mother and Trevor. It was 2 pages, and it did not raise its voice on paper any more than I had raised mine in Arthur's office. It stated the facts. The trust amendment bore a signature inconsistent with mine, supported by forensic analysis. An unauthorized credit line had been opened using company credentials on a date I could independently verify I was 2 hours away. And unless both matters were resolved, the amendment rescinded and the credit line accounted for, through Ashford's own internal fraud process, and a corrected trust filing within 14 days. We would pursue formal legal action, including a request that the court appoint an independent trustee pending investigation. For 3 days, there was silence, which in a family that had never once gone 3 days without a phone call about anything, told me more than any voicemail could have. Then the campaign started. Not from a lawyer, from my mother, calling relatives I hadn't spoken to in months. My aunt on my mother's side called to tell me, gently but firmly, that tearing the family apart over paperwork was exactly the kind of thing that would have broken my father's heart. A family friend from church mentioned, at the grocery store of all places, that she'd heard I was trying to steal the business out from under my own brother. A version of events so inverted it took my breath away for a second before I recognized it for what it was. The same instinct my mother had always had, to build the story before anyone else could, and let volume do the work that evidence couldn't. I answered none of it directly. I corrected no one at the grocery store. I have learned, the hard way, that explaining yourself to people who've already decided the story is a waste of a voice that will be needed later, in a room where it actually counts. Trevor tried a different approach. He showed up at my house on a Sunday evening, unannounced, and stood on my porch with the particular sheepish charm he's always deployed when he needs something. He didn't apologize, he explained. The business had needed the cushion, he said. He'd meant to tell me. Mom had said it would be easier if I didn't have to worry about it. As for the amendment, his eyes slid sideways when I brought it up, and he said quietly, that Mom had handled the paperwork side of things, and that he honestly hadn't looked closely at what he'd signed. I asked him directly, "Did you know the signature on that amendment wasn't mine?" He didn't answer. He looked at his shoes and said, "Maggie, can we not do this? Just sign the corrected version. We'll fix the percentages, make it more fair, and this all goes away." There it was. Not an apology. An offer to renegotiate the terms of the fraud, as though the only problem had been the split, not the forgery itself. "What percentage would feel fair to you, Trevor?" I asked. I genuinely wanted to know, because I think some part of me was still testing whether there was a version of him underneath all of it that understood what he'd actually done. He shrugged and said something about maybe 55-45, since I've been putting in the operational work lately. And I remember standing on my own porch, in my own doorway, listening to my brother try to negotiate the terms of his forgery of my signature as though it were a difficult but ultimately reasonable business disagreement between two partners who simply saw things differently. That was the moment I understood, fully and finally, that he did not see what he had done as theft. He saw it as an aggressive but justifiable renegotiation, and he expected me, as always, to eventually come around to seeing it his way too, the same way I always had before. I told him no. Not unkindly, I've never once raised my voice at my brother in my life, and I wasn't going to start on my own front porch, but completely, and without room for a follow-up offer. I told him the same thing I'd tell the judge 3 weeks later, almost word for word. "Trevor, I'm not signing anything else in this family without a notary, a lawyer, and a paper trail, ever again." He left without saying much else. That was the last real conversation we had before the courtroom. The hearing took place on a Thursday morning in the Buncombe County Courthouse, a heavy stone building downtown that I had walked past 1,000 times, without ever imagining I'd sit inside one of its wood-paneled rooms across from my own family. My mother and Trevor arrived with their attorney, the same younger man from Arthur's office, now representing what he called the trust's operational continuity. My mother wore a navy dress, and the kind of composed, faintly wounded expression she'd perfected over 30 years of getting her version of events believed. Trevor wouldn't meet my eyes. My Aunt Deborah, my father's sister, the one relative who had called me the week after the demand letter went out, not to lecture me, but simply to ask, "What do you actually need from me, Maggie?" sat behind me in the gallery. She'd driven up from Columbia that morning without being asked twice. Diane opened by walking the judge, a measured woman named Judge Patricia Holloway, through the timeline, the trust, my father's original equal distribution intent, the amendment, and the forensic findings. She called Renata Ford to the stand first. Renata testified plainly, without theatrics, walking the court through stroke pressure, letter formation, and her professional opinion that the signature on the amendment was inconsistent with my genuine signature, and consistent instead with an older exemplar. Then the bank's compliance officer testified, confirming the in-person signing date on the credit line disbursement and confirming, under questioning, that the branch's own security footage from that date, subpoenaed weeks earlier, showed a woman matching my mother's description at the counter that afternoon. Not me. When it was my turn, opposing counsel tried exactly what I expected. He suggested I was a bitter, controlling older sibling who had never accepted her brother's growing role in the company. He asked whether I'd ever expressed resentment about Trevor's involvement. I answered plainly, the way I would answer a tax auditor. I had expressed concern, on the record, in writing, multiple times, about specific financial decisions, and I produced, at Diane's prompting, the very emails documenting those concerns, sent months before any of this had surfaced, each one polite, dated, and entirely focused on the numbers. He tried a second angle, suggesting that perhaps I simply didn't remember signing the amendment, that grief and stress could affect memory. I told him calmly that I keep every signed document I've ever produced in a personal archive precisely because memory isn't something I rely on in matters like this, and that was exactly why I could say with total certainty that I had never seen that document before the day it was presented to me in Arthur Kessler's office. Then Diane stood, walked to the evidence table, and asked the court's permission to submit one final exhibit, the folder I had built over 8 months, containing every document in chronological order. The original bank inquiry, my written correspondence, the badge scan report placing me 2 hours from the branch on the disbursement date, the forensic report, and on top, a single clean summary page comparing my verified signature against the forged one, side by side, with Renata's key findings highlighted in the margin. Judge Holloway opened the folder and began reading. She read for what felt like several minutes, though it was probably closer to 90 seconds, turning each page slowly, and the room went the kind of silent where you can hear the air handling system click on in the ceiling. My mother's attorney shifted in his seat. Trevor stared at the table. My mother's composed expression, for the first time all morning, cracked at the edges, not into tears, but into something tighter, more startled. The look of someone watching a story they'd built for months collapse in real time under its own weight. Judge Holloway finally looked up, first at Diane, then briefly, directly at my mother. "I have significant concerns about the authenticity of this amendment," she said, "and about the circumstances surrounding this credit line. I'm ordering an immediate suspension of the amended distribution terms pending a full investigation, and I'm appointing an independent forensic accountant to conduct a complete audit of the trust and the company's financial records over the past 18 months. She looked at my mother's attorney. "I'd also strongly encourage your clients to consult separate counsel from this point forward, given what I'm reading here." That was the moment. Not a shouting match, not a dramatic confession, just a judge's calm procedural sentence, and the sound of my mother's composure finally giving out in a room full of strangers. I want to describe that 90 seconds of silence properly, because it's the part people always ask me about afterward, the part the thumbnail promises, and the part I think about more than almost anything else that happened. It wasn't dramatic in the way television makes courtrooms look. Nobody gasped. Nobody stood up. It was quieter than that, and somehow heavier for being quiet. My Aunt Deborah's hand found my shoulder from the row behind me at some point during those 90 seconds, and I don't think either of us said a word about it afterward, but I remember exactly how it felt. Steady, the way my father used to be steady, the way I had been trying to be steady for 4 years without anyone in that family really noticing the effort it took. Trevor's attorney kept glancing sideways at my mother throughout, the way you glance at someone when you're starting to suspect they told you a version of events that isn't going to survive contact with a judge's reading glasses. And my mother sat with her hands folded in her lap, in the same posture she'd held through every family dinner, every trust meeting, every carefully worded phone call to a relative I hadn't spoken to in months. Except now there was nothing left for that posture to manage. The story had run out of room to keep being true. Court dates rarely end things cleanly, and this one didn't either. But it started a process that, over the following months, took on a momentum of its own. The same kind of momentum Diane had warned me about the day I signed the affidavit. Once the system takes hold of something like this, it doesn't care whose mother is on the other side of the table. The independent audit, completed 6 weeks later, confirmed what I already suspected, but hadn't had the full picture of. The $95,000 credit line had been drawn down almost entirely to cover Trevor's personal debts from his previous failed ventures, funneled through 2 intermediate transfers designed to make the trail harder to follow on a casual read. Though not, it turned out hard enough to survive an actual forensic audit. The trust amendment was formally voided by court order. The original equal distribution terms my father had specified were reinstated. Trevor was removed from any operational authority over the company pending the outcome of a separate civil action Diane and I filed to recover the misappropriated funds, and the county district attorney's office opened its own inquiry into the forgery, given the involvement of a notarized legal document. My mother was never criminally charged. The forgery had, in the end, been executed with her access to the old lockbox and, the audit later confirmed, her own hand, a detail Renata's supplemental analysis of the specific letter forms eventually pointed to, comparing the forged signature's underlying rhythm not just against mine, but against known samples of my mother's handwriting from decades of birthday cards and church bulletins, but proving it beyond a reasonable doubt in a criminal court, without Trevor's cooperation, proved to be its own separate mountain, and I made the same choice my counterpart in a similar story once made. I was not interested in spending years of my life pursuing a criminal case against my own mother. I was interested in getting my father's company back on solid ground. and in making sure nobody in that family could ever again use my name on a piece of paper without my knowledge. Trevor, facing both the civil suit and the DA's inquiry, eventually agreed to a settlement. A structured repayment plan for the misappropriated funds, a permanent removal from any ownership or operational role in Sinclair Precision Components, and a formal notarized statement, drafted by his own attorney this time, and reviewed line by mine, acknowledging his role in both the credit line and the amendment. He now works, last I heard from my Aunt Deborah, in equipment sales for a distributor 2 counties over. We are not close. I don't know if we ever will be again, and for the first time in my life, I've made peace with the idea that family helps family doesn't have to mean I keep paying for it indefinitely. My mother and I see each other now at the minimum required occasions, a cousin's baptism, a holiday gathering where the room quietly rearranges itself so we're never seated too close together. She has told a version of this story to anyone in Asheville still willing to listen, one where I took the company from my own brother out of jealousy. Fewer people believe it than she'd like. Asheville is a small enough town that court records don't stay quiet for long, and a public hearing has a way of settling arguments that private conversations never could. I run Sinclair Precision Components now, fully, on paper as well as in practice. Sole trustee appointed operating officer, per the court's revised order, with the trust's original equal distribution terms restored as the framework for any future changes, none of which can happen again without independent legal review, something I insisted on personally when the paperwork was redrafted. I kept my father's fireproof lockbox. It lives in a real safe now, in my own home, not a hall closet anyone else has access to. Every original document with my signature on it, everyone, is cataloged, copied and stored in triplicate, a habit that used to make people smile a little indulgently at me, back when they thought it was just a personality quirk, instead of the thing that eventually saved everything my father built. I think about that hospital room a lot. Keep them steady, Wendy. No, that's not right. That's not my line. Let me say it the way my father actually said it to me. Keep them steady, Maggie. Don't let anybody break it apart for parts. I used to think keeping the family steady meant absorbing every cost so nobody else ever had to feel discomfort. I understand now that it meant something much simpler and much harder. Protect what your father actually built, even from the people who share his last name, especially if it comes to that. 6 months after the ruling, I got a short handwritten letter from Trevor, no excuses in it, which surprised me more than anything else in this entire story. Just a few lines saying he understood why things had to happen the way they did, and that he was sorry, actually sorry, the word standing alone at the end of a sentence, without an explanation trailing behind it, trying to soften it into something forgivable on his terms instead of mine. I haven't written back yet. I might, someday. The door isn't locked, but the company isn't up for negotiation anymore, and neither is my name. If 5 years of being the responsible one taught me anything, it's this. The people who are most comfortable using your trust are always the first ones to call your boundaries a betrayal. Let them. Set the boundary anyway and keep the paperwork. That's my story. 1 demand letter, 1 forensic examiner, 1 folder that made a courtroom go silent, and a business my father spent his whole life building, finally standing on solid ground again in the right name, for good. If this reminded you to actually read what you're signing, take that as your sign to double-check something today. If someone you love is quietly being erased from something that's rightfully theirs, share this with them. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.